Some movies don't just push boundaries, they crash through them, leaving outrage in their wake. These are the films that had politicians raging, theaters pulling showings, and audiences split in two. What happens when a story is deemed too much for America? Let's roll back the reels and uncover 20 that the nation tried to hide. The Birth of a Nation, 1915. Few films have left such a complicated legacy. D.W. Griffith's The Birth of a Nation was hailed at the time for its groundbreaking camera work, massive battle scenes, and innovative editing. It was one of the first true epics in cinema history, proving movies could be more than just short novelties. But its storyline, portraying Reconstruction-era America through a deeply prejudiced lens, was something else entirely. It painted a false picture of history that glorified the Ku Klux Klan and depicted African Americans in demeaning, inaccurate ways. The reaction was explosive. Civil rights groups, including the NAACP, called for boycotts. Cities like Chicago, Denver, and Pittsburgh outright banned it. In some cases, screenings led to protests and even violent clashes. The controversy was so intense that it led to some of the earliest discussions about film censorship in the United States. It's a strange contradiction, a film that was technically revolutionary, yet morally regressive. Today, it's studied not just for what it achieved artistically, but for the damage its narrative caused. The Birth of a Nation is a reminder that movies can shape public perception, for better or worse, and sometimes the worst wins the box office. Häxan, 1922. If you walked into Häxan not knowing what to expect, you might think you'd accidentally stumbled into a silent documentary, until it veered into unsettling territory. This Swedish import billed itself as a study of witchcraft through the ages, mixing historical reenactments with eerie, dreamlike imagery. Director Benjamin Christensen pulled no punches, showing scenes of witch trials, medieval torture devices, and surreal visions straight out of a nightmare. American audiences in the 1920s were used to tidy morality tales. This was something else entirely. The film's depictions were considered too disturbing, too strange, and too graphic for the times. Local censorship boards in the U.S. cut or banned it entirely. Some critics praised it for its artistry, while others dismissed it as dangerous and inappropriate. What makes Häxan fascinating today is how ahead of its time it was. It blurred the lines between documentary and horror decades before. That was a recognized style. But back then, the mix of educational tone and haunting visuals left censors unsure whether they were looking at history, fantasy, or an outright threat to public morals. For modern viewers, Häxan stands as proof that cinema has always had the power to disturb, even without a single spoken line. Scarface, 1932. Before Al Pacino's Tony Montana, there was Paul Mooney's Tony Camonte, a ruthless bootlegger carving his way to the top of the Chicago underworld. Howard Hawks' original Scarface wasn't just violent for its time. It celebrated a gangster's rise in a way that seemed to glamorize lawlessness. That was a direct clash with the Hays office, which had strict rules about how criminals could be portrayed on screen. Censors demanded changes, including a new ending where the main character faced justice. Some states banned it outright, worried it would inspire impressionable viewers to admire gangsters instead of fearing them. Hawks and producer Howard Hughes fought back, defending the film's integrity and refusing some of the edits. The result was a patchwork release. In some places, you saw the original cut. In others, a toned-down version. Despite the censorship battles, Scarface became a template for every gangster movie that followed. In the end, it's ironic. The attempts to suppress Scarface only helped it gain a rebellious mystique. The movie's tagline dared audiences to see what the fuss was about, and they did. Turns out, nothing sells tickets like a ban. Ecstasy, 1933. European cinema in the 1930s had a reputation for being more daring than Hollywood, but few imports caused as much stir in America as Ecstasy. Directed by Gustav Machati and starring a then-unknown Hedy Lamarr, the film combined romantic drama with bold storytelling choices that American audiences weren't used to seeing. When it arrived in the U.S., censors zeroed in on scenes they deemed inappropriate, claiming the movie went far beyond acceptable boundaries for the time. Some states refused to show it altogether. In others, heavily edited versions tried to soften the impact, but the film's reputation had already made it infamous. The controversy didn't hurt Lamar's career. In fact, it made her a name to watch in Hollywood. But for Ecstasy, the ban meant it would live in the shadow of its scandal for decades. Even when restrictions loosened years later, the movie was remembered less for its artistry and more for the uproar it caused. It's a classic example of how a film can become legendary not because everyone saw it, but because so many people were told they couldn't. Two-Faced Woman, 1941. By the early 1940s, Greta Garbo was already a legend, and Two-Faced Woman was supposed to be her light-hearted comeback. Instead, it turned into a lightning rod for censors. The romantic comedy cast Garbo as a ski instructor who pretends to be her own fictional twin to win back her wandering husband. Playful enough on paper, but in execution, some thought it crossed moral lines with its cheeky innuendo and portrayal of marital mischief. The National Legion of Decency slapped it with a condemned rating, and certain U.S. cities, including Boston and Atlanta, refused to screen it altogether. The studio scrambled to make cuts, but the damage was done. Audiences were already curious, and critics were already talking. The irony? Compared to today's romantic comedies, Two-Faced Woman is incredibly tame. But in 1941, the combination of a glamorous star, a suggestive plot, and a winking attitude toward propriety was enough to send censors into overdrive. The controversy overshadowed the film's actual box office performance, and it ended up being Garbo's final movie. Sometimes a film gets banned not for what it shows, but for how boldly it teases what it might. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, 1974. When audiences first saw the title, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, they already had a pretty good idea this wasn't going to be a polite night at the movies. What they didn't expect was the relentless, grimy realism that made it feel like they were watching something they weren't supposed to. Shot on a shoestring budget, Tobe Hooper's horror film was soaked in sweat, dirt, and an oppressive sense of dread. While it wasn't as graphic as its reputation suggested, the sheer intensity was enough to disturb viewers. Several states initially refused to screen it, claiming it was too disturbing for public audiences. Ironically, the film contains less on-screen gore than many modern horror movies, but the editing, sound design, and performances made it feel almost too real. Censors couldn't decide whether to cut it down or ban it outright, and the inconsistency only fueled its notoriety. Over time, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre became a horror classic, but in 1974, it was the kind of movie people whispered about, the one your friend claimed they saw and still couldn't sleep afterward. Deep Throat, 1972. In the early 1970s, America was in the middle of a cultural tug-of-war between loosening social norms and deeply entrenched censorship laws. Deep Throat dropped right into the middle of it. The film's reputation was built on shock value, and while it played to packed houses in some cities, others fought to shut it down entirely. Prosecutors in multiple states launched obscenity trials against theater owners, distributors, and even the film's star. Some courts ruled it could be shown, others banned it altogether. The legal battles went all the way to the Supreme Court, which ultimately allowed states to set their own standards for what was considered too far. What's fascinating is how Deep Throat became more than a film. It became a political flashpoint. People who had never seen it still argued passionately for or against its right to exist. Whether seen as an attack on public morality or as a free speech issue, it was impossible to ignore. The uproar proved one thing. Sometimes a ban can make a film bigger than it ever would have been on its own. I Spit on Your Grave, 1978. This low-budget exploitation thriller was never aiming for subtlety, and it got exactly the reaction you'd expect. I Spit on Your Grave follows a woman seeking brutal vengeance after being attacked, but its unflinching depiction of violence made it one of the most divisive movies of the late 70s. Critics blasted it as gratuitous, while supporters argued it was a raw, angry statement about empowerment and justice. The controversy wasn't just about the violence, it was about how long the camera lingered and how graphic the details felt. In several U.S. cities, it was refused a screening license altogether. The backlash was so strong that even decades later, it's still brought up in debates about censorship and artistic intent. Despite the bans, the film found an audience in grindhouse theaters and eventually on home video, where it cemented its cult status. Love it or hate it, I Spit on Your Grave is a prime example of how a movie can be both reviled and revered, sometimes by the same people. The Devils, 1971. Ken Russell's The Devils wasn't just controversial, it was the kind of movie that made even seasoned critics squirm. Based loosely on historical events in 17th century France, it told the story of political power, corruption, and hysteria inside a convent. Russell filled the screen with intense imagery, stylized violence, and provocative performances that made censors everywhere nervous. In the US, the MPAA demanded heavy edits before it could get an R rating. Even with cuts, some theaters refused to screen it. Overseas, entire scenes were stripped out or banned outright. The uncut version wouldn't see the light of day in America for decades, and even then, it was usually only shown at special events or festivals. What makes The Devils fascinating is how it manages to be both operatic and unsettling. The set designs were surreal and beautiful, the performances fearless, and the atmosphere relentless. Critics were divided. Some hailed it as a masterpiece, others dismissed it as outrageous excess. For audiences at the time, it was a test. Could they look past the shock to see the political commentary underneath? For many, the answer was no, and the movie's reputation as too much became part of its legend. Salò, or The 120 Days of Sodom, 1975. Pier Paolo Pasolini's Salò is one of those films people talk about far more than they actually watch, and for good reason. Adapting the infamous Marquis de Sade novel, Pasolini moved the setting to fascist Italy during World War II. The result was a brutal allegory about power, control, and dehumanization. When it reached the US, it was met with outrage. Many cities refused to screen it at all. Those that did often faced protests. Critics either called it an unwatchable endurance test or a bold artistic statement about the extremes of human cruelty. What made Salò so unsettling wasn't just what it depicted, it was how relentless it was. Pasolini offered no safe distance for viewers to detach themselves. You were trapped in the same bleak world as the characters, forced to confront the corruption and sadism at the heart of the story. Decades later, it's still banned in certain countries and remains one of the most infamous films ever made. In America, it's a reminder that sometimes cinema's most powerful statements are the ones you never want to see twice. A Clockwork Orange, 1971. Stanley Kubrick's A Clockwork Orange is often remembered for its striking visuals, unforgettable soundtrack, and chilling lead performance by Malcolm McDowell, but in the early 70s, it was just as famous for the firestorm it caused. Set in a dystopian future, it followed a gang leader's violent exploits and subsequent rehabilitation through psychological conditioning. The stylized violence and unsettling tone put it on the radar of US censors, but it ultimately secured an R rating after some trims. That didn't stop individual cities from pushing back. Some theaters refused to show it, and it drew heated debates about whether it glamorized the very behavior it condemned. The controversy was even bigger in the UK, where Kubrick himself pulled it from circulation for decades after reports of copycat incidents. In the US, the movie still played, but always with a cloud of notoriety hanging over it. Looking back, it's easy to see why A Clockwork Orange rattled audiences. Kubrick didn't offer easy moral conclusions, and that ambiguity made the film more unsettling. It's a classic case of a movie's artistry and its controversy feeding each other until both became inseparable. If You Love This Planet, 1982. On the surface, If You Love This Planet doesn't seem like a movie that would stir up much trouble. It's a Canadian documentary about the dangers of nuclear weapons, featuring Dr. Helen Caldicott delivering a passionate lecture on the risks of nuclear war. But in 1982, the US government had other ideas. The Justice Department labeled it foreign political propaganda under the Foreign Agents Registration Act. That meant it had to carry a disclaimer whenever it was shown, essentially branding it suspect before the first frame even rolled. The label was enough to discourage many schools, broadcasters, and institutions from screening it. Critics saw the move as a direct attempt to silence a viewpoint the government didn't like. Supporters of the film argued that it was educational, not political. Either way, the controversy only increased interest among certain audiences, and it went on to win the Academy Award for Best Documentary Short. If You Love This Planet is proof that sometimes the fastest way to make people curious about a film is to tell them they shouldn't see it. Hillary, the movie, 2008. In the run-up to the 2008 Democratic primaries, a political group produced Hillary, the movie, a sharply critical documentary about then-Senator Hillary Clinton. But it wasn't just another campaign season attack piece. It became the center of a major free speech battle. The Federal Election Commission argued that airing the film during the primaries counted as a form of election advertising, which was restricted under campaign finance laws. They effectively barred it from being shown on TV during that period. The producers fought back, taking the case all the way to the Supreme Court. The result was the landmark Citizens United versus FEC decision, which struck down key parts of those campaign laws and opened the door for unlimited political spending by corporations and unions. In other words, the fight over whether Hillary, the movie, could be shown changed the entire landscape of American campaign finance. While the film itself remains relatively obscure compared to the legal battle it sparked, its place in U.S. history is undeniable. Sometimes the controversy isn't about what's in the movie, it's about who gets to decide whether you can watch it at all. Reefer Madness 1936. If you've ever heard of a movie so over the top it becomes comedy gold, chances are it's Reefer Madness. Originally titled Tell Your Children, this low-budget propaganda film was made to warn audiences about the supposed dangers of marijuana. The plot follows clean-cut teens whose lives spiral out of control after trying the drug, leading to crime, chaos, and wild overacting at every turn. At the time, it was shown mostly in churches and community halls, presented as a cautionary tale. But its exaggerated scenarios and melodramatic tone were so extreme that it became unintentionally hilarious. Local authorities in some states banned it, claiming it was either too lurid or too sensational to be a legitimate educational tool. Others criticized it for fear-mongering rather than informing. Decades later, Reefer Madness was rediscovered and embraced by college audiences as a camp classic. What was once a straight-faced warning became a late-night cult hit, with viewers laughing at the same moments that once horrified censors. It's a rare case of a film banned for being too sensational in its own era, only to be celebrated later for exactly that reason. Cannibal Holocaust 1980. Few movies have stirred as much uproar as Ruggero Deodato's Cannibal Holocaust. Shot as a found footage horror long before that term existed, it follows a rescue team retrieving the last recordings of a missing documentary crew in the Amazon, only to uncover shocking events. The film's realistic style convinced some viewers they were watching actual deaths on screen, which led to police seizing the film print in Italy and arresting Deodato on suspicion of murder. While those charges were eventually dropped, the movie still faced bans around the world, including in parts of the US, where distributors feared obscenity prosecutions. Its graphic imagery, both staged and controversially real animal killings, kept it from mainstream release for years. Critics were split. Some dismissed it as pure exploitation, while others argued it was a biting commentary on media sensationalism and Western exploitation of indigenous cultures. Either way, Cannibal Holocaust became infamous as the most banned movie ever made. In the US, the film's underground reputation only grew thanks to whispered recommendations, bootleg tapes, and horror fans daring each other to sit through it. Even today, it's less about whether you like it and more about whether you can handle it. The Last Temptation of Christ, 1988. Martin Scorsese's The Last Temptation of Christ wasn't a typical biblical epic, and that's exactly why it became one of the most protested films in U.S. history. Adapted from Nikos Kazantzakis' novel, it portrayed Jesus as fully human as well as divine, exploring moments of doubt, fear, and inner conflict. The film's most talked about sequence, in which Jesus imagines living an ordinary life instead of dying on the cross, sent shockwaves through certain audiences. In the months leading up to its release, protests erupted outside theaters. Major chains refused to screen it, and several cities tried to block it entirely. Some independent cinemas that did show it reported vandalism and bomb threats. Scorsese defended the film as a deeply personal exploration of faith and humanity, but the outrage often drowned out any nuanced discussion. While critics praised its artistry and Willem Dafoe's performance, the movie's legacy became defined by the storm around it. Decades later, The Last Temptation of Christ is still cited in debates about censorship, creative freedom, and how far filmmakers can go when reimagining sacred narratives. In 1988, it was a cultural flashpoint. Today, it serves as a reminder that even in America, a film can still spark nationwide controversy. From turn-of-the-century shorts to modern political flashpoints, these movies prove that too much is a moving target. What one era bans, another celebrates, and sometimes the very act of banning a film makes it unforgettable. Which of these would you watch if you had the chance? Drop your thoughts below, hit subscribe for more deep dives, and remember, the stories they try to hide are often the ones worth finding.